Cowboy promised to marry the Apache girl when she grew up years later. She returned to claim his heart and save her land. Have you ever made a promise you thought was just a joke, only to have it come back years later and change your life forever? The Arizona sun blazed mercilessly over the broken land in the winter of 1878. 11-year-old Aiyana ran through the sparse juniper forest, her bare feet bleeding, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind her, the shouts of men and the crack of rifles echoed off the canyon walls. She clutched a small leather pouch to her chest, her father's sacred medicine bundle, the last remnant of her people's ways. Her father, the medicine man of the White Mountain Apache, had pressed it into her hands with his final breath. "Run, little one, run and do not look back. The spirits will guide you." She had obeyed, though every instinct screamed at her to stay, to fight, to die beside him. Now the winter cold bit through her torn dress. The men were closing in. She could hear their horses, the jangle of spurs, the cruel laughter. They were men from the timber company sent to clear the Apache from land that held old-growth ponderosa pine trees worth more than human lives, apparently. Comment #5 if you loved this story, and subscribe to the channel so you'll never miss even better ones ahead. Don't hesitate. Hit that subscribe button. Aiyana stumbled over a root and fell hard, the pouch flying from her hands. She scrambled after it, but a shadow fell across her path. She looked up into the face of a young man, perhaps 19, with sun-bleached hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. He held a rifle, but it was pointed at the ground. For a frozen moment they stared at each other, the Apache child and the white stranger. Then Silas Walker made a choice that would echo through both their lives: the hollow land. "Don't move," Silas said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos approaching. He could hear the timber company's men crashing through the brush, their voices growing louder. He'd been tracking deer when he'd stumbled upon their hunt, and realized with sick certainty that they weren't hunting animals. Aiyana's dark eyes burned with defiance, even as tears streaked the dust on her cheeks. Blood seeped through the torn fabric at her shoulder, not a deep wound, but enough to paint her sleeve dark red. She clutched the medicine pouch tighter, prepared to fight this tall stranger with her bare hands if necessary. The scent of sage and smoke clung to her skin, mixed with the copper tang of blood. Her hands trembled, not from fear alone, but from cold so deep it felt like knives in her bones. Silas glanced over his shoulder, then made his decision. He shrugged off his coat and draped it over the girl's thin shoulders. The weight of it made her flinch. "There's a hollow in the rocks 30 yards east. You see that bent juniper?" He pointed with his chin, keeping his hands visible, non-threatening. "Hide there. Don't come out until full dark." "Why you help Aiyana?" whispered in halting English, suspicion and desperation warring in her young face. Her fingers dug into the leather pouch until her knuckles whitened. "Because it's right," Silas replied simply. The words felt inadequate, even as he spoke them. How could he explain that he'd seen too much cruelty, that somewhere in the past year he'd crossed a line between observer and participant in injustice, and he wouldn't cross it again? Then the voices grew too close, and he straightened, stepping between Aiyana and the approaching men. She hesitated only a heartbeat before darting into the shadows, moving with the silent grace her father had taught her. Silas watched her disappear into the twisted juniper branches, then positioned himself casually against a tree rifle resting in the crook of his arm. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his face remained calm. 3 riders emerged from the scrub, hard men with cruel eyes and dust coating their clothes like a second skin. Silas recognized the lead rider immediately, Thaddeus Hammond, foreman for the Western Timber Company. Hammond's reputation for violence preceded him throughout the territory. Men whispered that he'd killed 3 Mexicans in a land dispute down south, burned out a homesteader who wouldn't sell beaten a Paiute woman senseless for refusing his advances. Walker Hammond said, his eyes narrowing as he reined in his horse. The animal's breath steamed in the cold air. "What are you doing out here hunting?" Silas replied, evenly grateful. His voice didn't betray the adrenaline singing through his veins. "Lost a buck when all your shooting started. Thought maybe there was trouble." "Apache trouble," one of the other men spat. He was younger, maybe 25, with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow. Savages attacked our survey crew, burned equipment. We're tracking them down. Silas doubted that very much. More likely the attack had been Apache defending their land from encroachment, and the tracking was an excuse for murder. But he kept his expression neutral, his body language relaxed. Seen any come through here? Hammond studied him for a long moment, and Silas felt the weight of that scrutiny like a physical thing. The foreman's eyes were the color of mud, flat and cold. Finally, Hammond gestured with his rifle toward the west, away from where Aiyana hid. Tracks head that way. You see anything, you let us know. Company pays good bounties. The casual mention of bounties payment for human lives made Silas's stomach turn. He nodded. Will do. The men rode off, but Silas stayed where he was listening until the sound of hooves faded completely into the vast Arizona silence. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and snow from the higher elevations. A hawk circled overhead, its cry sharp and lonely. Only then did he move toward the hollow where Aiyana hid. He found her pressed into a crevice between two boulders, her eyes wide in the dimness. She'd wrapped his coat tighter around herself, but still shivered violently. In the fading light, Silas could see the delicate beadwork on the medicine pouch's surface, symbols he didn't understand but recognized as sacred. Spirals and lightning bolts, stars and creatures he couldn't name. They're gone, he said softly, crouching down to make himself less threatening. For now. Aiyana emerged slowly, still clutching the pouch. Her bare feet were torn and bloody, leaving dark prints on the stone. She couldn't have been running long in this condition, maybe an hour, maybe two, which meant the men who'd killed her family weren't far behind when Silas had found her. Your family, he asked gently, though he already knew the answer from the grief carved into her young face. Dead, she whispered. Her voice cracked on the word. Father, uncles, cousins, all dead. She looked down at the pouch, and her next words came out in a rush of Apache and broken English. Father said run. Say take this. Medicine. Sacred. They want burn it. Burn everything. Silas felt something crack open in his chest. He'd lost his own mother to fever 3 years ago, knew the particular emptiness of that loss, the way it carved out pieces of you that never quite filled back in. But this child had watched her father die, watched her whole world burn, and now stood alone in a hostile wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back and a leather pouch. I have a cabin, he said. Not far. You'll be safe there tonight. We'll figure out what comes next in the morning. They come for pouch, Aiyana said, holding it up. Her hands had stopped shaking, and Silas saw the steel underneath the terror. This girl was a survivor. Father's medicine. Sacred, white men say, is devil work. Say we worship evil, but is not evil, is old. Is she struggled for the word connection. To earth, to sky, to what came before. Then we'll keep it safe, Silas promised. The words felt heavier than they should have, as if he were making a vow that bound him to more than just this moment. He led her through the darkening forest, moving carefully, listening for any sound of pursuit. His cabin lay in a remote hollow, built by his own hands after his mother's death, when he'd wanted nothing more than to escape the world of men. It was small, one room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn bed, a table and single chair, but it was sturdy and warm, and most importantly hidden. Inside he lit a lamp and stoked the fire, while Aiyana stood uncertainly by the door, still wrapped in his oversized coat. She looked impossibly small in that moment, impossibly vulnerable. Soot streaked her face. Her hair, once neatly braided, had come loose in wild tangles. Sit, he said, gesturing to the chair. I'll make something warm. As he prepared a simple meal of cornmeal mush and dried venison softened in hot water, Aiyana watched him with wary eyes. She flinched at sudden movements, tensed when he came too close. But gradually, as the cabin warmed and the smell of food filled the air, some of the rigid terror left her shoulders. Why you help? She asked again, her voice stronger now. White men hate Apache. White men say we are animals. Less than animals. The question cut deeper than she knew. Silas had been raised on stories of Apache raids, of violence and theft, But he'd also worked alongside Apache scouts, learned some of their language, heard their stories of displacement and broken treaties. The truth he'd come to understand was more complex than the simple narratives his people told themselves. The Apache weren't the villains in this story, or if they were, it was only because white men had written the tale to serve their own interests. "Not all white men hate Apache," he said, finally, ladling mush into a wooden bowl. "And what those men did today, hunting your family like animals, that's not right. Not by any law I know, not by any law that matters." Aiyana considered this, then slowly lowered herself into the chair. She accepted the bowl he offered, eating slowly at first, then with increasing hunger. When she'd finished, Silas gave her a blanket and gestured to his bed. "Sleep. I'll keep watch." But Aiyana didn't move toward the bed. Instead, she carefully opened the medicine pouch and withdrew something, a bracelet woven from leather cord and small beads, each bead carved with tiny symbols that caught the lamplight. She held it out to Silas with both hands, her expression solemn beyond her years. "For protection," she said in careful English. "Spirits watch over you. You save me. Now I give this. When I grow up strong," she struggled with the tense, "maybe I save you too." It was meant as thanks, perhaps as comfort to herself, the idea that someday she might repay this debt. Silas smiled, gently, feeling a sudden, unexpected tenderness. "When you grow up strong," he replied, taking the bracelet with careful hands. "Maybe you will." The moment he tied it around his wrist, warmth spread up his arm, not the heat of fire, but something gentler like sunlight on skin. For a heartbeat he could have sworn he heard singing in a language he didn't know, felt the pulse of something vast and ancient moving through the earth beneath his feet. Then the sensation faded, leaving only the weight of the bracelet and the girl's dark eyes watching him. As Aiyana finally settled onto the bed, exhaustion claiming her, Silas tied the bracelet securely around his wrist. The beads were smooth under his fingertips, worn by time and touch. He settled into his chair by the window rifle across his knees and watched the night deepen over the Arizona wilderness. Outside, coyotes called to the rising moon, high-yipping cries that echoed off distant canyon walls. Inside, a child slept fitfully, murmuring in Apache, one hand clutching the medicine pouch even in dreams. And Silas Walker, who had wanted nothing more than solitude, found himself bound by an invisible thread to a culture and a people he barely understood. Before dawn, as Aiyana still slept and the first gray light crept across the floorboards, Silas heard movement outside. Not heavy footfalls, but the whisper-soft approach of someone who knew the land intimately. He raised his rifle, then lowered it as an older Apache man emerged from the shadows, moving with surprising grace despite his years. The man was perhaps 60, his face deeply lined, his long hair shot through with silver. He wore traditional clothing, deerskin and trade cloth, and carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. When he spoke, it was in Apache, his gaze moving past Silas to where Aiyana slept. Silas caught only a few words, granddaughter, safe, gratitude, but the meaning was clear. He held up his hands in a gesture of peace, then pointed to Aiyana. The old man approached the bed, and Aiyana's eyes opened immediately. For a moment she simply stared. Then she sat up with a cry that was half sob, half joy, flinging herself into his arm. They spoke rapidly in Apache, and Silas caught his own name mentioned several times, along with glances in his direction. Finally, the old man turned to Silas and spoke in careful, accented English. "I am Nata, medicine man of the White Mountain people, grandfather to this child. You saved her life. This debt I will not forget." "No debt," Silas said firmly. "I did what was right." Nada's weathered face creased in a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Those eyes had seen too much loss for easy smile. "The young man who walks between worlds. Yes, Aiyana told me of your kindness." He studied Silas with a gaze that seemed to see far more than the surface. "The spirits have marked you, Silas Walker. You walk a path that few white men walk. It will be difficult. You will be trusted by neither your people nor mine. But it is necessary." Before Silas could ask what that meant, Nada turned back to Aiyana. They spoke for several more minutes. Then Nada pressed something into her hands, another small pouch, similar to the one she'd been carrying. Medicine, perhaps? Or sacred objects? His voice dropped low, and Aiyana nodded seriously. "We go now," Nada said to Silas. "To Sacred Valley, where your people cannot find us. Where we keep the old ways alive even as the world changes around us." His expression grew grave. "But we will remember. And perhaps one day you will have need of us as we had need of you today." Aiyana approached Silas, her young face solemn beyond her years. She touched the bracelet on his wrist with one finger, and again Silas felt that pulse of warmth. "When I grow up," she said in halting English, "I will be strong. Maybe I save you too. Not maybe. I will." Silas smiled, feeling that unexpected tenderness again. In the gray dawn light, this child seemed to carry the weight of generations. "When you grow up strong," he replied gently, "I'll remember this promise." It was meant as comfort, nothing more, a kindness to a traumatized child. But as Aiyana and her grandfather vanished into the pre-dawn shadows, moving with the silence of deer through forest, Silas felt the bracelet warm against his skin, and he wondered not for the first or last time if he'd just made a promise far more binding than he understood. He stood in his doorway long after they'd gone, watching the sun rise over the broken land. Somewhere in the distance, smoke rose, the timber company burning what they'd cleared, marking their conquest. The wind carried the scent of burning pine, acrid and wrong. Silas touched the bracelet, feeling the smooth beads under his fingertips. 7 small beads, each carved with symbols. He counted them without thinking. 7, a sacred number in many traditions, including Apache. 7 directions. 7 sacred mountains. 7 generations. He didn't know then that this bracelet would never leave his wrist. That 7 years would pass before he saw Aiyana again. That when she returned, she would indeed save him not from danger, but from a loneliness he'd worn so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to belong anywhere at all. The sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. Silas went back inside, closed the door, and tried to return to his solitary life. But the bracelet remained warm against his skin, and he knew, though he couldn't have said how, that something fundamental had shifted, that his path had been altered in ways he wouldn't fully understand for years to come. That a promise made to a frightened child in a moment of kindness would become the axis around which his entire world would turn. 7 years of silence. Arizona Territory. Winter 1885. Silas Walker was 26 now, lean and weather-beaten, with lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, and deeper lines around his mouth from years of not smiling. His small ranch outside Bitter Creek wasn't much. 40 acres of scrubland and a dozen head of cattle that required constant vigilance against drought predators and his own occasional incompetence. But it was his paid for with 7 years of hard work and careful living. He stood on his porch in the cold December dawn, coffee mug warming his hands, and watched the eastern sky lighten. The bracelet still circled his wrist, worn now but intact. He'd never taken it off, though he couldn't have explained why. Habit, maybe. Or superstition. Or the way it sometimes grew warm in the night, as if responding to something beyond his understanding. The leather had darkened with age, and sweat the beads smooth from years of touch. Sometimes he found himself counting them without thinking. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, like a rosary, like a prayer he didn't know the words to. 7 years since he'd seen the girl. 7 years of dreaming. The dreams had started almost immediately after Aiyana left. At first, they were simple flashes of firelight, the sound of singing in Apache, the scent of sage burning. But over time, they'd grown more vivid, more specific. He'd dream of a girl growing into a woman, learning to grind corn with smooth stones to tan hides, using techniques passed down through generations, to sing songs that made the air shimmer with something that felt like prayer. Sometimes in the dreams he'd hear her voice calling his name across vast distances. Sometimes he'd see through her eyes, would wake with the memory of hands that weren't his own, weaving baskets, grinding herbs, touching the earth with reverence he'd never learned in his own culture. Foolishness, he told himself every morning. 7 years had passed. Aiyana, if she'd even survived, would be 18 now, a woman grown. She'd probably forgotten all about the strange white man who'd sheltered her for a single night. The bracelet was just a bracelet leather, and beads nothing more. The dreams were just dreams, products of loneliness, and too many nights spent alone. But the bracelet remained warm against his skin, and the dreams persisted. He was saddling his horse for the day's work, riding fence, checking on the cattle in the south pasture, maybe hunting, if he saw sign when he felt it, a prickling at the back of his neck like the moment before lightning strikes, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Silas turned slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward the pistol at his hip, thumb touching the hammer, though he didn't cock it. His breath clouded in the cold air. A figure emerged from the morning shadows near the tree line, moving with unconscious grace that made his breath catch. The young woman who approached wore a mix of Apache and settler clothing, practical riding clothes, adorned with subtle beadwork deerskin moccasins and a blanket wrapped around her shoulders against the cold. But it was her eyes that stopped Silas, cold, dark, intelligent, and utterly familiar, even though they belonged to a face he barely recognized. She was no longer a frightened child. She'd grown tall, her movements confident, her bearing suggesting someone who knew her own strength. Her long, dark hair was braided with small beads that caught the light. 7 beads worked into the braid, he noticed. Her face had lost its childish roundness, becoming elegant, striking in a way that had nothing to do with conventional beauty and everything to do with presence, with the sense that she occupied space with authority. Silas Walker, she said, her English now clear and confident, carrying only the faintest musical accent. It has been a long time. His coffee mug slipped from his numb fingers, shattering on the porch boards. Coffee spread like blood across the wood, steaming in the cold. Aiyana, he breathed the name coming to his lips without thought, without question. A smile touched her face, transforming it from striking to radiant. You remembered. Not everyone does. She took a step closer, and morning light caught the silver threads in the blanket around her shoulders. A pattern he didn't recognize, but felt was significant. Some white men, they help an Apache child, they forget the next day. Like it never happened. Like we're not real enough to remember. I remembered, Silas said, his voice rough. He cleared his throat, tried again. You're alive. You're well. I survived, Aiyana said simply. She moved closer, and Silas noticed she carried a small leather bag similar to the one she'd clutched so desperately 7 years ago. Same shape, same size, but the beadwork was different. More elaborate, speaking of hundreds of hours of careful work. My grandfather took me to Spirit Valley. There I learned the old ways, the medicine and songs of our people. Her expression grew more serious. I learned many things, including that I owe you a debt. You owe me nothing, Silas said quickly, finally finding his voice and his manners. Please come inside. You must be cold. Have you traveled far? 2 days' ride? Aiyana replied, but she followed him into the cabin. Her gaze swept the interior, taking in the sparse furnishings, the neatness born of solitary living, the row of books on a makeshift shelf, law books mostly, and a few on surveying and land rights. You live alone. It wasn't a question, but Silas answered anyway. Yes. He busied himself making fresh coffee, grateful for something to do with his hands. The cabin felt smaller, with her in it, the air charged with something he couldn't name. 7 years is a long time to be alone. But you chose it, Aiyana observed. She'd moved to the window, looking out over his small ranch. You could live in town. Take a wife. But you stay here between the white world and the land that once belonged to my people. Why? The question cut too close to truths. Silas barely acknowledged to himself. I don't fit in town, he said finally, handing her a tin cup of coffee. Their fingers brushed as she took it, and the bracelet on his wrist flared warm. Aiyana's eyes dropped to it, and something like satisfaction crossed her face. And the land doesn't belong to anyone. It just is. Now you sound like an Apache, Aiyana said with a slight smile. But the smile faded quickly. My grandfather is dying. Before he joins the ancestors, he sent me to find you. He says, she paused, choosing words carefully. He says, you are needed. Silas's chest tightened. The old medicine man who'd looked at him with such knowing eyes, who'd spoken of paths and spirits and debts that couldn't be measured in gold or goods. Needed for what to save Spirit Valley. Aiyana said simply. She set down her coffee and reached into the leather bag, withdrawing papers, official-looking documents, with government seals and legal language. And perhaps, if the spirits are kind, to save my people. Over the next hour, as the sun climbed higher and the coffee grew cold, Aiyana told him what had happened in the years since they'd parted. The Western Timber Company, now under new management, but no less rapacious, had been systematically acquiring Apache lands through legal manipulation and outright theft. They'd found allies in corrupt Indian agents and territorial officials, men who saw indigenous people as obstacles to profit rather than human beings with rights. The old Hammond was gone, died 3 years back of a heart attack. Some said, or poison, others whispered. But his son had taken over, and the son was smarter, more careful, more ruthless in his way. "They're cutting down the sacred groves," Aiyana said, her voice tight with controlled fury. Her hands gripped her coffee cup so hard Silas thought it might shatter. "The old trees that have stood for hundreds of years, that hold the memories of our ancestors. They say they have legal claim that the government granted them rights to unoccupied lands." Her voice hardened on that word, turning it into an obscenity. "Our lands are not unoccupied. We have lived there since the beginning of time, since the earth was new, and the first people emerged from the darkness below." "What does this have to do with me?" Silas asked, though he suspected he already knew. The law books on his shelf weren't just for show. He'd taught himself land law surveying principles, the complex web of treaties and regulations that governed territorial holdings. Taught himself in the long, lonely evenings, telling himself it was just intellectual curiosity, refusing to acknowledge that he was preparing for something, waiting for something. "You walk between worlds," Aiyana said, echoing her grandfather's words from 7 years ago. "You understand both our people and yours. My grandfather saw this 7 years ago, in the moment you chose mercy over indifference. And he sees it still in his visions." She met his eyes directly, and Silas felt the full force of her presence, her determination. "He believes you are meant to be a bridge, Silas Walker, to help us find a way to protect Spirit Valley that your people's laws will recognize." It was an impossible task, Silas knew. The territorial government rarely sided with Apache claims, and timber companies had deep pockets and deeper connections. But looking at Aiyana, at the determination in her eyes, the straight pride of her bearing the way she held herself, like someone who'd learned to carry loss without being crushed by it, he found himself unable to refuse. His life for the past 7 years had been empty, he realized suddenly. Comfortable, safe, but empty. Going through motions, existing but not living. And here, sitting in his cabin drinking bitter coffee, was purpose. Connection. The thing he'd been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. "Tell me what you need," he said. Relief washed over Aiyana's face there, and gone so quickly he might have imagined it, but her voice when she spoke was steady. "Come to Spirit Valley. Meet with my grandfather and our elders. Help us understand the white man's laws, and perhaps," she paused, "perhaps help us find proof that the timber company's claims are false. That could be dangerous." Silas warned, though even as he said it, he was mentally cataloging what he'd need. His rifle ammunition supplies for a week or more, the surveying tools he'd acquired, copies of territorial land, regulations. "If Hammond's son finds out I'm helping you, if the Indian agent reports it to the territorial governor, I know," Aiyana interrupted. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his, the first time she'd deliberately touched him. Her palm was warm, calloused from work, and where skin met skin, the bracelet blazed so hot Silas flinched. But he didn't pull away. "I would not ask if the need were not great. But I remember what you risked for me 7 years ago. I remember your kindness when you had every reason to turn away. And I remember a promise." She pulled back her own sleeve, and Silas saw she wore a bracelet too, a match to his 7 beads carved with the same symbols, though the leather was newer. "When I made this for you, my grandfather wove certain protections into it, certain connections. It binds you to Spirit Valley, to our people, to me." Her eyes met his dark, and unfathomable. When I said I would save you one day, I meant it. Not from death, perhaps, but from the half-life you've been living, from walking between worlds but belonging to none. The words hit harder than any physical blow could have. Silas looked down at the bracelet he'd worn for 7 years, at the beads smoothed by time and touch. "I'll come," he said quietly, "but I can't promise I can help. The law is written by those with power, to keep themselves in power," Aiyana finished. "I know. I've learned this in the years since I saw you, but laws can be challenged. Loopholes can be found. And sometimes, Silas Walker, the right person in the right place, can shift the balance just enough to change everything." They left at dusk, traveling by night to avoid notice. Aiyana led the way with unerring confidence, navigating by stars and landmarks invisible to Silas's eyes. They spoke little during the journey, partly from caution, partly from the simple fact that some things didn't need words. The silence between them felt companionable rather than awkward comfortable, in a way Silas hadn't felt with another human being in years. He found himself watching her profile in the moonlight, trying to reconcile this capable young woman with the terrified child he'd sheltered. She'd grown into herself, with a quiet strength that commanded respect, not demanding it, not forcing it, but earning it through simple competence and unshakable certainty in her own worth. "You're staring," Aiyana said, without turning her head, a hint of amusement in her voice. "Sorry," Silas muttered, feeling heat rise to his face. Thank God for darkness that hid his expression. "I was just thinking how much you've changed." 7 years is a long time, Aiyana agreed. She glanced at him then, and moonlight caught her eyes, making them seem to glow. "You've changed too." Quieter. More, she searched for the word alone. Not lonely like you're missing something. Alone like you've taught yourself not to need anything. Not to want anything. The observation stung because it was true. After his mother's death, after the realization that his father's drinking would kill him too, if Silas stayed after years of drifting from job to job, never belonging, never fitting, he deliberately walled himself off, built his small ranch, his small life, and told himself it was enough. That wanting more only led to disappointment. "It's easier that way," he said finally. "Is it?" Aiyana asked gently. "Or just safer?" Before Silas could answer, she held up a hand, signaling silence. They'd reached a narrow canyon, its walls rising steep and dark on either side, blocking out the stars. The air grew noticeably colder, carrying the scent of water, and growing things even in winter. "We're close now," she whispered. "But we must be careful. There are timber scouts in these hills watching for anyone who might interfere with their operations." They dismounted and led their horses through the canyon on footboots, crunching on gravel that sounded thunder loud in the enclosed space. The path twisted and climbed, growing narrower, until Silas had to turn sideways to squeeze through certain passages, his horse's flanks scraping rock. Just when he was beginning to wonder if they'd somehow gotten lost, if the canyon would simply close in until they were trapped, the walls fell away. Spirit Valley spread before them in the moonlight. Silas's breath caught. It was a hidden bowl of meadow and forest, sheltered on all sides by towering cliffs that seemed to touch the sky. Even in winter, even in darkness, he could feel the peace of this place, the sense of sanctuary that had drawn the Apache here. A lake gleamed like polished silver in the valley's heart, its surface perfectly still, reflecting stars with crystalline clarity. Smoke rose from scattered dwellings, wickiups, mostly traditional dome-shaped structures, but also a few more permanent buildings. The scent of pinon smoke and cooking meat carried on the cold air, making Silas's stomach growl despite his nervousness. "Beautiful," he breathed. "It is the heart of our people," Aiyana said softly, and he heard the love in her voice, the bone-deep connection to this place. "The last place where we can live, according to the old ways, where children can grow up hearing the language and learning the songs. Where we remember who we are." She turned to him, her face grave in the moonlight. "If we lose this Silas Walker, if they take this valley, we lose more than land. We lose ourselves. We become what they want us to be, ghosts, memories, curiosities in history books." Spirit Valley is not just our home. It's proof that we still exist, that we're still here, that we haven't vanished like so many other peoples. The weight of that statement settled over Silas like a physical burden. This wasn't just about property rights or legal technicalities. This was about survival, cultural survival, spiritual survival, the kind that couldn't be measured in dollars or acres. They made their way down into the valley, and Silas became aware of eyes watching from the shadows, sentinels protecting their hidden home. Aiyana called out in Apache, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air, and gradually figures emerged. Warriors, their faces painted for guard duty, their eyes wary but respectful as they looked at Aiyana. One young man stepped forward, his bearing suggesting both pride and barely leashed hostility. He was perhaps 25 tall and lean with the coiled readiness of someone trained for combat. He spoke to Aiyana in rapid Apache, his gaze flicking suspiciously toward Silas every few seconds. "This is Dakota Aiyana," explained, switching to English. "My cousin and one of our finest warriors. I've told him of your kindness 7 years ago." She spoke to Dakota in Apache, and gradually his stance softened, though suspicion remained in his eyes. Dakota addressed Silas in careful accented English. "Aiyana says you saved her life when she was child. For this you are welcome in Spirit Valley." He paused, then added with cold precision, "But know that we watch you, white man. One wrong move, one word to the timber company or the Indian agent, and you will not leave this valley alive." Dakota Aiyana said sharply, but Silas held up a hand. "I understand," he said, meeting the warrior's eyes steadily. "If I were in your place, I'd say the same, probably with fewer words and more threats." A ghost of a smile touched Dakota's lips. "Perhaps you are not like other white men. We will see." But he stepped aside, allowing them to pass. They continued through the sleeping village past traditional wickiups and a few more permanent structures that spoke of a people adapting to changed circumstances while trying to maintain their identity. Smoke rose from cook fires, and the smell of sage hung in the cold air, mixing with pinon and something else, some herbs Silas didn't recognize, sweet and slightly medicinal. Dogs barked softly, announcing their passage. A few people emerged from dwellings, curious faces, peering at the tall white man following Aiyana. Children whispered to each other, pointing, until their parents shushed them. Finally, they reached a larger dwelling set slightly apart from the others, positioned to overlook the lake that gleamed like polished obsidian in the moonlight. Silas could see why this spot had been chosen. It commanded a view of the entire valley, while remaining sheltered, defensible. "The Spirit Lake," Aiyana said softly, gesturing to the water. "The heart of the valley, the place where the veil between this world and the world of spirits grows thin. Where my grandfather speaks with the ancestors." Her voice dropped. "Where he will soon join them." She pushed aside the hide covering the entrance, and Silas followed her into warmth and firelight. An old man lay on a bed of furs, his face deeply lined, his body frail in a way that spoke of imminent death. But his eyes, those eyes were bright and alert as they fixed on Silas, recognition and something like satisfaction flickering across the weathered face. "So Nada," said in English, his voice surprisingly strong for someone so obviously dying. "The young man who walks between worlds returns. The spirits have brought you back to us, as I knew they would, as I have seen in dreams these 7 years. Shelter." Silas approached the old medicine man respectfully and knelt beside the bed, close enough to speak quietly, but not so close as to intrude. The firelight cast shadows that danced across Nada's face, making him seem somehow both ancient and ageless. "Aiyana says you're ill. I'm sorry." Nada waved this away with one thin hand, the gesture surprisingly dismissive. "All men die. The question is whether we die having completed our purpose, having walked the path the spirits set before us." His gaze intensified, and Silas felt as if those dark eyes could see straight through him, past the walls he'd built, past the careful control, down to the lonely truth at his core. "I have one task left, Silas Walker. To ensure Spirit Valley survives beyond my death, that my people have a place to remember who they are. And I believe, no, I know, you are meant to help us achieve this." "I'll do what I can," Silas promised, though doubt gnawed at him. But I'm just one man, and the timber company has lawyers, connections, money, has many things. Yes, Nata interrupted, but they do not have what you have. He gestured to the bracelet on Silas's wrist, and Silas saw that Nata's own wrist bore a similar bracelet, older the leather, cracked with age, but unmistakably of the same kind. The blessing of the spirits, the gift of seeing two worlds without being blinded by either. And something more. His eyes moved to Aiyana, who stood silently by the fire. A connection to my granddaughter that transcends the ordinary bonds between your people and mine. Silas felt heat rise to his face. He hadn't thought his attraction was that obvious, the way his eyes kept finding her, the awareness of her presence, like a physical thing. I don't. The spirits work in mysterious ways. Nata continued, a slight smile touching his lips. 7 years ago they brought you to Aiyana's aid, when she needed it most. Now they bring you both together again at the moment when her people need what only you two working together might provide. This is not coincidence. This is not chance. This is the pattern, the path, the way things are meant to be. He reached out, and Aiyana took his hand, kneeling on the opposite side of the bed. Stay. Learn our ways. Help us find a path through this darkness. And perhaps in doing so, find the path you were always meant to walk. As the fire crackled and Nata's eyes drifted closed in exhaustion, Silas looked at Aiyana. She met his gaze steadily, and in that moment he felt the invisible thread that had connected them for 7 years pull taut vibrate like a plucked bowstring. He'd come to Spirit Valley to repay a debt, to help if he could, but he was beginning to suspect the debt was only the beginning of a journey neither of them could yet fully comprehend. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of learning and teaching, of slow trust, built through shared work and quiet conversations. Nata had been right. Silas walked between worlds, and in Spirit Valley, that ability became not a liability, but an asset. Aiyana became his guide, and his student in equal measure. In the mornings she would take him walking through the valley and the surrounding canyons, teaching him to see the land as her people saw it, not as property to be owned, but as a living entity to be respected and understood. Listen, she would say, placing her hand flat against the earth, her fingers splayed wide against cold ground. What does the land tell you? At first Silas heard nothing but wind, and his own breathing felt nothing but the embarrassment of a grown man kneeling in dirt trying to commune with rock and soil. But gradually, as the bracelet warmed against his wrist, as Aiyana's patient instruction sank in, he began to sense something. Vibrations, rhythms, the deep pulse of water moving through underground channels, the shift and settle of stone, the whisper of roots spreading through soil. The earth remembers Aiyana, explained one cold afternoon as they sat on a ridge overlooking the valley. Every footstep, every drop of rain, every life that has passed across it, the earth holds these memories. If you quiet your mind, if you stop trying to control and categorize and own, you can hear them, feel them. She taught him words in Apache, not just the names of things, but the concepts behind them, the worldview that shaped her people's relationship with everything around them. There was no word for wilderness in Apache, she explained, because how could something be wild if you lived in harmony with it? No word for taming the land, because the land wasn't an enemy to be conquered. Your people think of themselves as separate from nature, she said. Above it, outside, it meant to control it. But we are part of it, made from the same earth, breathing the same air, drinking the same water. When the land suffers, we suffer. When we honor the land, it sustains us. In return, Silas taught her what he knew of the legal system that threatened her people. He explained property rights, as the white man understood them, the concept of deeds and surveys and legal claims that turned living land into abstract lines on paper. They would sit in his temporary shelter, a small wickiup the villagers had built for him, and go over documents by lamplight. Aiyana learned quickly, her intelligence cutting through legal obfuscation to the core of each issue. So the white man believes land can be owned, she said one evening, her finger tracing the survey map spread between them, like a horse or a tool. Yes, Silas confirmed. But who gave him the right to claim it? Aiyana challenged, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his breath catch. The land was here before any man, white or Apache. It will be here after we're all dust and memory. How can something so ancient, so enduring, belong to creatures as temporary as us? It was a question Silas had no good answer for. The longer he spent in Spirit Valley, the more his own culture's assumptions seemed arbitrary, even absurd. Ownership, property. The idea that you could draw lines on a map and claim dominion over mountain and river and ancient forest, it all began to feel like an elaborate fiction, a shared delusion that worked only because everyone agreed to believe in it. But it was a fiction with real power, backed by guns and law and the weight of government. And that meant they had to engage with it, challenge it, on its own terms. One afternoon, as they worked together to repair a fence near the valley's eastern edge, keeping cattle in, keeping casual intruders out, Aiyana paused in her work and looked at him. "You're different than you were 2 weeks ago," she observed, wiping sweat from her forehead, despite the winter cold. "Physical labor warmed you quickly." "How so?" "Quieter." More, she searched for the word, present. "You listen now, not just with your ears, but with everything. You don't fill silence with noise. You don't need to be doing something every moment." Silas realized she was right. The constant mental chatter that had plagued him for years, the worries, the second-guessing, the sense of never quite fitting anywhere, had quieted in this hidden valley. He felt more himself here than he had in years. More whole, as if pieces of him that had been scattered were slowly gathering back together. "This place changes people," he said, hammering in another fence post. "Or maybe it just shows people who they really are when all the noise and distraction falls away. Or reveals what they could become," Aiyana suggested. She was close enough that he could see the fine beadwork on her dress, smell the sage she'd rubbed into her hair that morning. A practice, she'd explained, that kept the hair healthy and honored the plant's protected properties. "The valley has a way of stripping away what doesn't belong, leaving only what's essential." Their eyes met and held. Silas felt the pull of that invisible thread again, stronger, now insistent. It would be so easy to close the distance between them, to let this attraction that had been building for 2 weeks finally find expression. She was beautiful. Yes, but more than that, she was strong, intelligent, deeply connected to something larger than herself. She moved through the world with a purpose and grace he'd never encountered before. But a shout from the valley below shattered the moment like a rock through glass. Dakota was running toward them, his face tight with urgency, one hand on the rifle slung across his back. "Scouts," he called in English for Silas's benefit, his voice carrying in the cold air. "Timber company men surveying the eastern ridge. They're getting too close. Another week, maybe 2, and they'll find the canyon entrance." Nata called a council that evening. The valley's elders gathered in the largest wickiup, their weathered faces grave in the firelight. Silas sat slightly apart from the circle, conscious of being an outsider, but Aiyana gestured for him to move closer. "You are part of this now," she said quietly, her voice pitched for his ears alone. "Your voice matters. Your knowledge matters." The elders debated in Apache, their words flowing too fast for Silas to follow more than fragments. But the tension was unmistakable, palpable in the rigid shoulders, the sharp gestures, the voices that occasionally rose in anger or frustration. Some voices clearly argued for confrontation, others for retreat deeper into the wilderness. A few glanced at Silas with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright suspicion. Why trust a white man, any white man, with their survival? Finally, Nata raised his hand for silence. The gesture was small, but the authority behind it was absolute. The room fell quiet immediately. "The timber company grows bolder," he said, speaking first in Apache, then switching to English for Silas's benefit. But also Silas suspected to force the elders to hear their crisis, described in the language of those who threatened to them. "Their surveyors map our lands. Their lawyers file false claims with corrupt officials. Soon they will bring men with axes and guns, and they will cut our sacred groves as if they were cutting mere timber, as if ancient trees that have stood since before the white man came to this land were nothing more than lumber to be sold." He looked directly at Silas. "You know their ways. You understand their laws and their lies. How do we fight an enemy that uses paper as a weapon, that kills with documents and bribes instead of honest bullets? Silas took a deep breath, aware that every eye in the room was on him, judging not just his words, but his right to speak them. With paper of our own, he said carefully, if we can prove the timber company's claims are fraudulent, that they've bribed officials, falsified documents, used corrupt surveys, we might be able to challenge them in territorial court. Get their claims invalidated. Buy time to establish legal protections for the valley. And if we cannot prove this, an older warrior asked in heavily accented English, his scarred face skeptical, if their lies are too well crafted, if the officials are too deeply paid, then we make it too expensive for them to continue, Silas said. Delay their surveys, complicate their logistics, create enough obstacles that Spirit Valley becomes more trouble than it's worth. Meanwhile, we build political support, get newspapers to cover the story, appeal to sympathetic clergy and reformers back east, create public pressure that makes the territorial government think twice about siding with the company. Sabotage, another elder said, approvingly nodding. This I understand. We have fought this way before. But Nada shook his head, his expression grave. Violence will only bring soldiers. We've learned this lesson before, learned it in blood and loss. They will use any excuse to label us hostile, to justify removal, or worse. We must be smarter than that, more patient. He studied Silas with those penetrating eyes. Can you truly find proof of their corruption, evidence strong enough to stand in their courts? I can try, Silas said. The company's main office is in Prescott. If I can get inside, access their files. He trailed off, realizing the magnitude of what he was suggesting. Breaking into a timber company office, stealing documents, risking arrest or worse. It's too dangerous, Aiyana said immediately, her voice sharp with concern. Hammond's son knows your face. You worked for his father before you quit. If you're caught, then I'll be careful. Silas interrupted, turning to meet her eyes. You asked me to be a bridge between worlds. This is what that means, taking risks that people from either side alone cannot take. Using my access to their world, my understanding of their systems to protect yours. The council debated for hours, more voices rising and falling, arguments circling back on themselves as the fire burned down to coals. But eventually, reluctantly, a plan took shape. Silas would travel to Prescott under the guise of looking for ranch work, a plausible cover, as the winter had been hard, and many small ranchers were hiring on temporary help. While there, he'd attempt to infiltrate the timber company's offices and find documentary evidence of their illegal land claims. Letters, surveys, bribes, paid anything that could be used in court. It was dangerous, perhaps even foolhardy. If caught, he'd face charges of breaking and entering, theft, possibly conspiracy. The timber company had enough influence to ensure he'd hang, or at minimum spend years in territorial prison. But it was also the best chance they had. As the council dispersed and people drifted back to their dwellings, Aiyana caught Silas's arm. Her grip was strong, urgent. Walk with me, she said. They made their way to the Spirit Lake in silence, their breath clouding in the frigid air. The water glowed faintly in the starlight, perfectly still, a mirror for the vast Arizona sky. Silas remembered what Aiyana had told him, that this place was sacred, a threshold between the visible world and the realm of spirits, where prayers rose more easily, and the dead drew close to offer guidance. I should thank you, Aiyana said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, for risking so much, for believing us when you could easily side with your own people. You thanked me 7 years ago, Silas replied, touching the bracelet on his wrist. With this, I've worn it every day since. Never taken it off, not once. He met her eyes. I've never understood why it feels warm sometimes. Why I dream of this place even when I'm far away. Why I hear singing in a language I don't speak. Aiyana's expression grew distant, thoughtful. My grandfather made it, she said. Wove into it certain protections, certain connections. It links you to Spirit Valley, to our people. She paused, then added softly, to me. How is that possible? Because he's a medicine man. Because he sees things others cannot, walks paths between worlds that most people don't even know exist. She hesitated, then reached out and touched the bracelet, her fingers brushing Silas's wrist where pulse met leather. The contact sent a jolt through him like lightning, and suddenly he was seeing flashes of memory, not his own. A younger Aiyana, learning to grind corn with patient hands to tan hides, using techniques passed down through generations to sing the old songs that made the air shimmer. Nata teaching her the sacred ways, telling her of the white man who would return one day, who was bound to her by invisible threads of fate and choice. Her growing up with the certain knowledge that, somewhere beyond the valley, someone was connected to her in ways she barely understood, but trusted completely. Silas gasped and pulled back, breaking the contact. His heart hammered against his ribs. What was that? The connection, Aiyana said softly, and he saw that she was trembling too. It works both ways. When you wear the bracelet, sometimes I feel your emotions, your dreams, the loneliness that's been with you so long, you don't even recognize it anymore. And sometimes, if we both allow it, we can share more. Memories, feelings, the truth beneath the words we speak. That's not possible, Silas said, even as he knew it was true. He'd felt it, her memories, her feelings as real as his own. More real in some ways, because they came without the filters and justifications he wrapped around his own experiences. There's much about this world that your people would call impossible, Aiyana said, turning back to the lake. Stars reflected in its surface, thousands of points of light suspended in darkness. But that doesn't make it less real, less true. She wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. I've felt your loneliness, Silas Walker. Your sense of being caught between worlds, never fully belonging to either. And I've wanted to tell you you're not alone. Not anymore. You belong here if you choose to. With my people. With, she stopped, seemed to reconsider. With us. The words hung in the cold air between them, weighted with meaning that went beyond friendship, beyond simple alliance. Silas wanted to respond, to close the distance that separated them both physically and emotionally, but the weight of what he was about, to attempt the danger, the risk, the very real possibility of failure held him back. When I return from Prescott, he said instead, his voice rough, we'll talk more. About all of this. About what comes next. Aiyana nodded, accepting the postponement, even as disappointment flickered across her face. May the spirits protect you, she said formally, the blessing her people gave to warriors, leaving for battle. Then, more personally, more intimately, come back to me, Silas Walker. You promised once that when I grew up strong I might save you. I cannot do that if you don't survive long enough for me to fulfill that promise. It wasn't quite a confession of feeling, but it was close enough to make Silas's heart race. I'll come back, he promised. That's one vow I absolutely intend to keep. Trust and bond. Prescott sprawled across a high plateau, a territorial capital built on whiskey ambition and the unshakable conviction that this land was meant for white men to civilize and profit from. The buildings were a mix of rough lumber and adobe brick, the streets a churned mess of mud and frozen ruts. Signs proclaimed establishments, ranging from saloons to assay offices, boarding houses to brothels, all doing brisk business despite the cold. Silas arrived on a cold January morning, dressed in his plainest work clothes, looking like just another ranch hand down on his luck, and hoping the city might offer better prospects than the failing homesteads scattered across the territory. The Western Timber Company's offices occupied a prominent building on Courthouse Square, 3 stories of red brick and white trim, projecting prosperity and permanence in a town where most structures still look temporary. The company's name was painted in gold letters across the front. Western Timber Company, Hammond and Son, established 1872. Silas studied it from a saloon across the street, nursing a beer he didn't want, and listening to the conversations flowing around him like water around stone. Hammond's boys are hiring one man, said, his words slightly slurred, even though it wasn't yet noon. Heading up to the high country come spring to clear another section. Paying decent wages too, if you don't mind hard work, and maybe a little trouble with the Apaches. I heard they're pushing into territory that's supposed to be reservation land. Another man replied, this one more sober, more cautious. That's asking for trouble. Government's supposed to protect those lands. Ain't no Apache reservation up there, the first man said dismissively. Government gave it all to the company fair and square. Legal-like. Any Injuns left up there are just trespassing on company property. They got no rights to it. Silas bit back a retort and focused on gathering information. Over the next 2 days, nursing drinks he barely touched, playing cards with men whose faces he'd forget. By tomorrow, he learned the company's rhythms. When the offices emptied for lunch, when Hammond's son made his rounds, where the records were likely kept, which clerk was approachable, which was fiercely loyal to the Hammond. He also learned that Hammond had recently brought in a new partner, a man named Elias Thorne, a lawyer from back east, with a reputation for creative interpretations of land law, the kind of lawyer who could make illegal claims look legal, who could navigate the gray areas between outright fraud and technical compliance. On the third day, Silas made his move. The offices emptied for lunch as predicted, leaving only a skeleton crew. He entered through a side door, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged, who had every right to be there. A young clerk glanced up from his desk, his face fresh and unlined, probably not more than 18. "Help you looking for Mr. Thorne," Silas said easily, his voice calm. "I have information about potential timber leases up near the White Mountains. Mr. Hammond said I should talk to his partner about the legal details. Mr. Thorne's at lunch. You can wait in the aisle, just leave a note in his office." Silas interrupted, already moving past the clerk, with the easy assumption of someone used to being obeyed. "Which one is it?" "Second floor." "But you can't just—" Silas was already climbing the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, but not rushing, not drawing attention. Behind him he heard the clerk dithering, uncertain whether to follow or return to his work. By the time the young man decided, Silas was already at the top of the stairs and out of sight. He found Thorne's office easily. The name was painted on the frosted glass in gold leaf: Elias Thorne, Esquire, Land Council. The door was locked, but Silas had learned a few tricks during his years of solitary living, including how to pick simple locks. A thin piece of metal from his pocket, carefully applied, and the lock clicked open with a sound that seemed loud as a gunshot in the quiet hallway. Inside the office was orderly, almost to the point of obsession. Mahogany desk polished to a mirror-shine, leather chairs, positioned with geometric precision, walls lined with law books, arranged by size and subject. Filing cabinets stood against one wall, each drawer labeled in precise handwriting. Silas went straight for the cabinets, fingers flying through folders: land deeds, survey reports, correspondence with government officials, purchase agreements, the mundane paperwork of legal theft, dressed up in official language and stamped with government seals. Then, in a folder marked Apache Territories, confidential, he found it. Letters between Thorne and a corrupt Indian agent named Parsons. Correspondence detailing payments made in exchange for favorable survey reports that classified Apache lands as abandoned and therefore available for claim. Falsified documents claiming that certain areas, including Spirit Valley, though it wasn't named as such, had been inspected and found unoccupied. Even a memo written in Thorne's own hand, suggesting that difficulties with stubborn Apache families might need to be resolved through strategic application of force. It was everything they needed. Proof of conspiracy, fraud, bribery. Evidence that would blow the company's claims apart if presented to an honest judge, assuming they could find an honest judge in a territorial system shot through with corruption. Silas pulled out the most damning documents, folding them carefully into his coat. His hands trembled slightly as he did so, adrenaline and fear mixing into a cocktail that made his vision sharper, his hearing more acute. He was about to close the cabinet when he heard footsteps in the hall. The door opened. Elias Thorne stood in the threshold, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the cold eyes of someone who saw people as obstacles to profit rather than human beings with rights and dignity. His hand moved immediately toward the desk drawer where Silas suspected a pistol was kept. "Can I help you?" Thorne asked mildly, though his voice carried the undertone of a threat. His other hand remained on the door handle, ready to slam it shut, to call for help, to do whatever was necessary. "Just leaving," Silas said, edging toward the door with his hands visible, non-threatening. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to bolt, but that would only confirm guilt. I don't think so. Thorne's hand emerged from the drawer with a small derringer, the kind of gun that fit in a palm, but could kill at close range. You're the one, aren't you, Walker? Hammond mentioned you said you'd help some Apache girl years back quit the company over it. Thought you might cause trouble eventually. Looks like he was right. Silas assessed his options rapidly. The window was too far 3 stories up anyway. The derringer was close enough to be deadly. He needed to talk his way out to bluff, I don't know what you're talking about, he said, evenly holding Thorne's gaze. I'm just looking for work. Someone downstairs said, don't insult my intelligence. Thorne gestured with the gun toward the desk. Empty your pockets. Slowly. Silas complied, placing the documents on the desk one by one. Thorne glanced at them, and his expression hardened from mere coldness into something approaching genuine anger. You've just made a serious mistake, Mr. Walker. Breaking and entering theft of company property consorting with hostile Indians. He shook his head, and Silas saw a flash of something like satisfaction in those cold eyes. I believe that's enough to see you hanged. Territorial courts don't look kindly on Apache lovers and thieves. Or it's enough to see you ruined, Silas countered, playing his only card. Those documents prove you've been bribing federal officials, falsifying land claims, using corrupt surveys to steal land from its rightful inhabitants. The territorial governor might be interested in that. So might newspapers back east that are always looking for stories about Western corruption. For a moment, genuine fear flickered across Thorne's face. Then it hardened into calculation, the look of a man deciding that murder might be preferable to exposure. Who would believe an Apache lover against a respected attorney? Thorne said softly, raising the derringer slightly. You have no proof you didn't forge these yourself, and I think the story will be that I caught an intruder breaking into my office. Shot him in self-defense. Tragic but completely justified under territorial law. The derringer's barrel looked impossibly large from this angle, a black hole that could swallow his entire future. Silas tensed, preparing to dive for the desk, knowing he'd probably be too slow, but unable to simply stand there, and the door burst open. A young woman stood in the threshold, her presence so unexpected that both men froze. She was perhaps 20, with auburn hair pinned up in the latest fashion and wearing an expensive dress that marked her as quality as someone with money and status. But it was her expression, fierce and determined, intelligent eyes taking in the scene with rapid assessment, that commanded attention. Lower that gun, Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice carrying the crisp accent of East Coast education. Unless you want the territorial marshal to know you've been embezzling company funds for the past 2 years. Thorne's face went white. Miss Hammond, I don't know what lies you've been. I'm not stupid, and I'm not a child. The young woman, Hammond's daughter, apparently interrupted. She held up a leather-bound ledger, the kind used for accounting. I've been reviewing my father's books. Papa's not well, you know. Heart troubles. So I thought I should understand the business in case, well. She smiled, and there was nothing warm in it. The money that should be in operating accounts is mysteriously absent. But I found interesting deposits in accounts bearing your name. And I have documentation. Quite a lot of it. Your father will never believe you, Thorne said desperately, but the derringer had lowered slightly. Perhaps not immediately. But the bank will, and the territorial governor, Papa's political rival, you'll recall, who would love an excuse to investigate Hammond operations, and the newspapers. Her smile grew colder. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to let Mr. Walker leave with those documents, and in exchange, I won't expose you as a thief and a fraud. You can keep your freedom and what little reputation you have left. Or you can shoot Mr. Walker, and I'll make sure you hang not for his murder but for stealing from my family. For a long moment, Thorne remained frozen, the derringer trembling in his hand. Silas could see the calculation happening behind those cold eyes, weighing risks, assessing threats, trying to find an angle that didn't end in ruin. Finally, slowly, he lowered the gun. Silas gathered the documents quickly, shoving them into his coat, keeping his eyes on Thorne even as he edged toward the door. The young woman, Miss Hammond, stepped aside to let him pass. As he reached the threshold, she spoke quietly, her voice pitched for his ears alone. Those documents will hurt my father as much as Thorn, perhaps more. He signed many of those letters, approved many of those bribes. I know, Silas said, meeting her eyes. Good. Her expression remained unreadable, but something like pain flickered in her eyes. He deserves it. What he's doing to those people, the lies, the violence, the casual destruction of lives and cultures, it's wrong. Morally wrong, whatever the law might say. I couldn't stop him, but maybe you can. Why help me? Silas asked, genuine curiosity overriding caution. Why betray your own father? She looked away, and when she spoke, her voice was barely audible. Because 7 years ago, my father's men hunted an Apache medicine man and his family. Killed them like animals. I was there. Papa thought it would be educational, teach me about the realities of frontier business. I watched it all. She closed her eyes briefly. I saw a little girl running through the snow. Saw men laughing as they chased her. And I've been ashamed every day since. I should have stopped them. Should have said something. I was a coward. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. I can't undo that. But maybe I can stop it from happening again. Before Silas could respond, before he could tell her that the girl had survived, that she was safe, she turned and walked away, back straight every inch, the proper Eastern lady. The door closed behind her, leaving Silas alone in the hallway with stolen documents and the realization that allies could come from the most unexpected places. He left Prescott within the hour, not even stopping to collect his horse from the livery. He bought a new mount, with money he couldn't really afford, and rode out of town at a controlled pace that suggested a man with legitimate business, not someone fleeing with evidence of corporate fraud. Only when the town had disappeared behind him did he let the tension drain from his shoulders, did he allow himself to believe he'd actually pulled it off. He rode through the night and the following day, pushing himself and the horse hard, stopping, only to rest the animal and grab a few hours of sleep in whatever shelter he could find. The documents stayed pressed against his chest under his shirt, their presence both a comfort and a constant reminder of what he carried, evidence that could change everything or get him killed if he wasn't careful. 3 days after leaving Prescott, exhausted and trail-worn, he reached the canyon entrance to Spirit Valley. The sun was setting, painting the cliffs in shades of gold and red, and for a moment, Silas simply sat on his horse and looked at that hidden entrance, feeling something in his chest loosen and expand. Home part of him whispered, "Your home," which was absurd, because this wasn't his home. He'd only been here a few weeks. He was an outsider, helping out of duty and maybe attraction, but certainly not because Aiyana appeared at the canyon mouth as if conjured by his thoughts. She stood silhouetted against the sunset, and even from a distance Silas could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself, like someone who'd been waiting, watching, hoping. When she saw him, when she recognized horse and rider, her whole body seemed to sag with relief. "You came back," she said, as he dismounted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I promised," Silas replied. She crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and pulled him into an embrace that drove the breath from his lungs. Her arms wrapped around him fiercely, desperately, and Silas felt her trembling. Or maybe that was him. Maybe they were both shaking with relief and reaction, and the simple fact of being alive and together again. The bracelet on his wrist blazed hot, and through it, Silas felt her emotions as if they were his own. The fear she'd carried for 3 days, the certainty that something had gone wrong. The relief so intense, it was almost painful. "I thought," Aiyana started, then stopped, pressing her face against his shoulder. "I had visions, dreams. I saw you cornered, saw a gun, saw—" She pulled back just enough to look at him, her hands gripping his arms. "You're all right. You're not hurt." "I'm fine." Silas assured her, though his legs felt weak, now that the adrenaline was fading, now that safety was real, and not just a desperate hope. "It was close, but I got the documents. Everything we need. Show me later," Aiyana said. "First you need rest. Food. You look like you haven't slept in days." "Haven't," Silas admitted. Didn't want to stop. Wanted to get back to make sure these documents made it safely to. He stopped, realizing what he'd been about to say. "To see you, to make sure you were all right, To be here with you where I belong. But Aiyana heard it anyway, or felt it through the connection between them. Her expression softened, and she reached up to touch his face with gentle fingers. Come, my grandfather is failing, but he's held on waiting for your return. He needs to see what you found before he walks the spirit path. They made their way into the valley as twilight deepened into night. Silas saw people emerge from their dwellings' faces, lighting with relief and what might have been respect as they saw him return. Children pointed and whispered. Warriors nodded acknowledgement. Even Dakota, standing guard near the council wickiup, raised a hand in greeting that bordered on friendly. But all of that faded when they entered Nada's dwelling, and Silas saw how far the old medicine man had declined in just 3 days. Nada lay on his bed of furs, his breathing labored his skin the color of ash. But his eyes, those eyes still burned bright as they fixed on Silas. You return, Nada said in English, his voice barely a whisper now. And you bring hope with you. I can feel it, see it in the way you carry yourself. Show me. Silas knelt beside the bed and carefully withdrew the documents from inside his shirt, as Aiyana translated, explaining the evidence of corruption and fraud, detailing the letters and bribes and falsified surveys. Nada nodded slowly. His breathing eased slightly, as if a burden had been lifted. This is good, he said finally. But paper alone will not save us. The white man's courts move slowly, and Hammond's son will not wait patiently while lawyers argue. We must be prepared for his response, for the violence that will come when he realizes his schemes are threatened. Then we prepare, Silas said. We organize the evidence, send copies to the territorial governor, make sure the newspapers get the story. Create enough public pressure that the company can't simply brush it aside or make it disappear. Nada smiled faintly, and for a moment, Silas saw the strength that must have been there before illness claimed him. You begin to think like one of us. Not just as an individual fighting alone, but as part of a larger whole, part of a community. This is good. This is how we survive together, supporting each other, drawing strength from our connections. He gestured weakly for Aiyana to come closer. Granddaughter, take Silas to the lake. Perform the binding ceremony. Tonight. Aiyana's eyes widened. Grandfather, that ceremony is for. It's sacred. It's only for those who will stand together against darkness. Nada interrupted gently but firmly. For those who will protect our people through the trials ahead. Is that not you both? Has this not been the path you've been walking, whether you acknowledged it or not? Silas looked between them confused. What ceremony? A sacred rite. Aiyana explained, her voice careful. It joins two people in spiritual bond. Not marriage exactly, but something deeper, something older. A linking of paths of destinies. It means, she paused, choosing words carefully. It means your life and mine become intertwined. That we walk forward together, supporting each other, protecting each other. That what affects one affects the other. It's not done lightly, Nada added, his voice fading. And it cannot be undone. Once bound in this way, you are connected for life in this world and whatever lies beyond. His gaze moved between them. But the spirits have been calling for this since the day you first saved my granddaughter's life 7 years ago. They brought you together then. They bring you together now, and they will need you bound, truly bound, for what comes next. Grandfather, you're asking, this is a huge commitment. We barely know each other as adults. Aiyana stopped, seemed to reconsider. What if he's not ready? What if I'm not ready? Then the ceremony will not take. Nada said simply. The spirits will know, and nothing will happen. But I think I know you are both more ready than you realize. Go, I will rest, while you complete what must be completed. Aiyana and Silas walked to Spirit Lake in silence, the weight of Nada's request settling over them like a physical thing. The night was cold, and clear stars scattered across the sky in profusion impossible to see in any town. Their breath clouded in the frigid air, and frost crunched under their feet. When they reached the lake's edge, Aiyana stopped. The water lay perfectly still, a mirror for the heavens, reflecting starlight, With such clarity it seemed you could fall upward into that reflected sky and never stop falling. "I need to explain what this ceremony means," Aiyana said quietly, not looking at him. "What my grandfather is asking of us. I'm listening." She turned to face him then, and in the starlight her face seemed to glow from within. "The binding ceremony links two souls. It's not marriage as your people understand it. There's no contract, no legal obligation, no exchange of property. It's older than that, more fundamental. It acknowledges that two people have chosen to walk the same path, to support each other through whatever the spirits place before them." "And if we complete this ceremony," Silas asked, "then we become Aiyana, search for words accountable to each other in ways that go beyond ordinary friendship or even love. Your pain becomes my pain. Your joy becomes my joy. We carry each other's burdens and share each other's strength. The connection you felt through the bracelet these 7 years, that will deepen, intensify, until there are no real barriers between us. No lies we can tell, no secrets we can keep. Complete honesty, complete trust, complete vulnerability." She wrapped her arms around herself, and Silas couldn't tell if it was from cold or fear. "It terrifies me," she admitted, "to open myself that completely to another person. To let someone see all of me, the anger, the grief, the darkness I carry. To trust that they won't use that knowledge as a weapon, won't reject me when they see who I really am." Silas understood because he felt the same fear, his own darkness. The guilt over killings during his army days. The shame of complicity in systems that destroyed people like Aiyana's family. The bone-deep loneliness he'd carried so long. It felt like part of his skeleton. All of that would be visible, tangible, undeniable. But looking at her standing there by the sacred lake, trembling with cold and fear, and something that might be hope, he realized the truth. He'd been bound to her for 7 years already, from the moment he'd chosen mercy over indifference, from the moment he'd tied that bracelet around his wrist and felt it warm against his skin. They'd been walking toward this moment. The ceremony wouldn't create something new. It would acknowledge what already existed, give it form and power and intention. "I'm afraid too," he said honestly. "I've spent years building walls, teaching myself not to need anyone, not to want anything beyond my small, safe life. What you're describing, it means tearing down every wall, every defense. It means trusting you with parts of myself I barely acknowledge exist." "Then we're both terrified," Aiyana said with a slight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "That seems like a solid foundation for a spiritual bond, doesn't it?" Despite everything, the danger, the fear, the sheer magnitude of what they were considering, Silas laughed. The sound echoed across the still water, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called in response. "Your grandfather said, 'The ceremony won't take if we're not ready,'" Silas pointed out. "Maybe we should trust the spirits to know better than we do whether this is right." Aiyana studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. Yes. Let's try." She began gathering materials from the pouches she'd brought: sage for burning corn pollen, for blessing tobacco, for offering. She built a small fire at the water's edge, the flames reflecting on the still surface, so it seemed fire burned both above and below the world. "Remove your boots," she instructed. "We walk into the water barefoot. It's painful, the water is ice cold this time of year, but pain is part of the ceremony. It reminds us that binding ourselves to another person means accepting their suffering along with their joy." They both removed their boots and stood at the water's edge. Aiyana lit the sage, letting the smoke curl upward into the night sky. She began to sing in Apache, her voice clear and strong despite the trembling in her hands. The melody was ancient, predating the arrival of white men by centuries, perhaps millennia. It spoke of connection, of belonging, of two paths becoming one. She took Silas's hand, and the bracelet on his wrist flared so hot he gasped. Then, still singing, she led him into the water. The cold was shocking, brutal, driving the breath from his lungs. Ice formed at the water's edges, and his feet went numb almost immediately. But Aiyana kept walking until they were waist deep, until the cold was so intense it became a kind of fire burning through every defense, every pretense, stripping him down to some essential core. "Now," Aiyana said, her voice barely steady, teeth chattering, "we drink from the lake. The water connects us to Spirit Valley, to all the generations who have drunk from this source. And then we speak truth." She cupped water in her hands and drank, her face tightening at the cold. Then Silas did the same. The water tasted mineral, ancient, like drinking liquid stone. It burned, going down cold, transforming into heat in his chest. "I'll go first," Aiyana said. She took both his hands in hers. And through the bracelets, Silas felt the current of her emotions: fear, hope, desire, grief, all mixing together into something vast and overwhelming. "Silas Walker, I see you. I see the loneliness you've carried, the guilt over things you cannot change, the walls you've built to protect a heart that's been hurt too many times. I see your kindness when you thought no one was watching, your courage when it would have been easier to look away. I see a man who walks between worlds because he's searching for a place to belong. And I say to you, you belong here, with me, with my people. You always have." As she spoke, images flooded through Silas's mind, her perspective of him over the 7 years they'd been apart. Dreams she'd had of a lonely man on a ranch, talking to horses, because he had no one else. Visions of him defending Apache rights in conversations with other settlers, never mentioning his personal connection. Moments when the bracelet had warmed on her wrist, and she'd known somehow that he was thinking of her across the miles. She'd been watching over him, he realized, praying for him, waiting for the moment when their paths would cross again. Now it was his turn. Silas took a shaky breath, the cold, making it hard to think, hard to find words for truths he'd never spoken aloud. "Aiyana," he began, and her name on his lips felt like a prayer. "I see you too. I see the strength that kept you alive when you should have died, the wisdom that taught you to adapt without losing yourself. I see your love for your people, your determination to protect them even at cost to yourself. I see your fear that you're not enough, that you'll fail them, that the weight you carry is too heavy." He squeezed her hands, feeling her tremble. "And I say to you, you're not alone. You've never been alone. From the moment you gave me this bracelet, we've been bound together, and I choose to make that binding permanent, real, acknowledged. I choose you, Aiyana. I choose this path, this people, this life. I choose it freely and completely." The moment the words left his mouth, something shifted. The water around them began to glow, faint at first, then stronger, a soft green-blue light that seemed to emanate from the lakebed itself. Silas felt warmth spreading through him. Despite the cold, felt the bracelet on his wrist, pulse in time with his heartbeat. Then the visions came, not images this time, but experiences. Memories that weren't his own, flooding through him with such intensity he couldn't tell where he ended and Aiyana began. He was 11 years old, running through snow chest, burning feet, bleeding. Father's last words echoing in his mind, "Run, little one." The leather pouch clutched to his chest, precious beyond measure. Terror and grief and determination mixing into something that tasted like blood and smoke. He was learning to grind corn with stones older than memory, her grandmother's hands guiding her movements. The rhythm of stone on stone grain slowly becoming meal, the meditation in repetitive work. Learning that patience was a kind of power, that slow, steady effort could transform hard kernels into sustenance. He was sitting with grandfather learning the old songs, the ones that called rain and blessed hunts and honored the dead. The weight of being chosen to carry forward traditions older than he could comprehend. The pride and terror of that responsibility. He was watching a white man ride away from camp, knowing somehow that their paths would cross again, that this man carried something important, something necessary for the survival of her people. And then, just as intensely, Aiyana experienced his memories. She was 10 years old, watching her mother die of fever, helpless, despite every remedy tried. The moment when breathing stopped and the person she loved most became an empty shell. Learning that death was final, that wanting someone to live wasn't enough to keep them alive. She was 17 in a cavalry unit following orders to clear an Apache camp. Seeing a family, mother, father, 2 children, and recognizing too late they were peaceful, unarmed. The moment of hesitation before superior officers ordered fire. The screams, the blood, the guilt that would stain every day after. She was alone in a cabin talking to a horse because there was no one else watching sunset after sunset from a porch built for one. The slow numbing of feeling the deliberate choice to want nothing because wanting hurt too much. She was tying a bracelet around her wrist, feeling something click into place like a key in a lock, knowing without understanding that this child had just changed her life in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. The visions faded slowly, leaving them gasping and trembling in the cold water. Tears ran down both their faces, whether from cold or emotion or the sheer overwhelming intensity